What you're looking at here is a partial skull, a skull that's gone unidentified until now. Since there was no DNA analysis at the time, the case went cold, but years later, Oregon's forensic anthropologists entered the picture.
This is a case that I briefly addressed in a video when the identity of the victim was established. But at that time, that was pretty much the beginning and the end of it. However, as time wears on, the mystery and intrigue of the following story has only become more and more bewildering. Two Forest Service workers working in the Mount Hood National Forest, just south of Government Camp, stumbled onto something unexpected. In the vicinity of Still Creek Road 2612 and Road 145, which would put it near Trillium Lake, these workers uncovered a partial human skull, along with a few small bone fragments and a human tooth. Recovered from the scene and analyzed by the state police medical examiner, it was believed the bones belonged to a young woman in her late teens or early 20s, or possibly a male of smaller stature. While it was initially felt the victim had been dead no more than a year, upon further examination it was determined these remains had likely been there for approximately 10 years. Moving on the likelihood that the victim was a woman, a clay rendering of the victim was created that has been the subject of nightmares to some, but it was just an early rendition. Later on, a more detailed sketch was created for the victim. Another examination in 2008 established that the remains had in fact belonged to a woman, 17 to 30 years of age when she died. She was of Western European ancestry, with pale white skin, brown hair, and brown or hazel eyes. It was at this time that DNA was also sent to the University of North Texas to have a profile established, and from there, the profile was disseminated to places like CODIS and NamUs. In 2019, the Oregon State Medical Examiner's Office received federal grant funding with the focus on performing further analysis on what were 100 unidentified skeletal remains, of which this Mount Hood victim was included. A combination of genetic genealogy and DNA phenotyping were performed. As these advancements were being made, I first stumbled onto this unidentified victim in my various research efforts, and even discussed it in some previous videos I produced, never thinking it likely that the case would soon be resolved. Little did I know that these analysis efforts had yielded a potential victim identity. This person's sisters were located and they provided DNA to try and match with the victim. And it happened. Almost 35 years after her remains were found, this elusive victim finally had an identity: Wanda Ann Herr. I briefly discussed this revelation in a video shortly after this happened, but with one mystery resolved, another has begun. And now, almost 2 years after she was identified, the circumstances of how Wanda turned up dead, along with many other things, remain unresolved, but not for a lack of trying by some. The circumstances surrounding Wanda's life were so obscure that she was never reported missing, and it wasn't known that she had been missing until her name came up in 2019. She was reported as last being seen alive at the start of June 1976, just a little more than 10 years before her remains were found. While she was 19 years old at the time she was last seen, the most recent picture uncovered of Wanda was from 1969, when she was only 12. An artist's rendering of what she may have looked like at 19 was later created. This early June 1976 date for when Wanda was last seen came specifically from her sisters, who had not grown up with her but visited her at this time. It was the last time they saw her, and they felt she might have run away shortly after. Because of this, it's unknown exactly when Wanda was last seen alive, but two things about her life are known. One, she was known to be a chronic runaway, and two, she was last known to be living in a, quote, group home. But even this aspect of Wanda's life is somewhat left in mystery. As far as a group home, this could have been a large facility, but it also could have been a single home with multiple people living there. In terms of upbringing, it's known that Wanda was born sometime in 1957 to Elton Robert Herr and Daisy Lou Ryan. Elton and Daisy were married in Tillamook, Oregon in 1952, but were divorced in 1963, when Wanda would have been about 6 years old. I noted, along with Redditors, that despite having sisters, Wanda is the only child listed under Elton on findagrave.com, while Wanda is the only child not listed under Daisy on that same website. While findagrave.com is not an infallible source, it's wondered if this meant that Wanda lived with her father after the divorce, while her sisters lived with her mother. Such would explain why her sisters said that they didn't grow up with her. It's also a wonder if this may have been the start of Wanda's unstable home life that led her to become a runaway. Whatever her circumstances, which again are practically unknown, she ended up in a group home at some point. And it's astonishing that this much is known, since looking into her past, authorities found no paper trail, no police reports, no driver's license or any other form of identification, nothing. It was also noted that the group home Wanda lived in was located in Gresham, just east of Portland. With this small lead, Redditors dug in and uncovered two places, one of which I'd heard of previously, where Wanda may have been living in 1976. Before discussing these two places, it's worth mentioning another mystery, which is whether Wanda had a disability of some kind. I mention this because these two places in Gresham were homes particularly for young people with disabilities. The first and lesser discussed of the two were the Albertina Kerr homes at 722 Northeast 162nd Avenue. This place was established for kids in need of psychiatric care who could also live on site. If Wanda were living here, it stands to reason she might have tried to run away. This complex's own director was quoted to say, "If you set out to create a system to destroy kids, you couldn't design a better one than we have right here." The other home, and probably the more likely of the two, was the Miri Center. The place had a longer name, but I won't say it here. Even the "re" in the name Miri references the R word, so I'll just call it the Center. It opened in 1968 as a home for disabled children, but by 1975 the center shifted more towards adults. This is intriguing in Wanda's case, as she would have turned 18 and become an adult in 1975. If she'd been there as a child, this shift would have been perfect timing for her. Alas, there's still no evidence Wanda was at either of these places, and the whole group home term remains a mystery in terms of what her actual living situation was like. And while the easy presumption is that Wanda, a chronic runaway, must have done just that, if she was living in a group home type situation, someone in that home may very well have been responsible for her disappearance and death. Unfortunately, homes such as these do have a dark history of attracting the wrong people, and by people, I mean those who work there. In the same year that Wanda was last seen alive, a man named Gerald Dunlap was hired at the Fairview Training Center in Salem, a large campus for people with disabilities. In 1979, Dunlap lured a resident, Janie Landers, away from Fairview, violently murdering her and leaving her body in a setting near Silver Falls, a rural setting just east of Salem, like where Wanda's remains were later found. As far as the possible theories regarding what happened to Wanda go, the following have been suggested. Wanda ran away from her group home and either traveled by foot or hitchhiked to the area where she died. This theory is the only one that implies she was not murdered, and because so few of her remains were recovered, the exact cause of her death has never been established. Wanda ran away from her group home and was picked up by someone who killed her and took her to where she was later found, or possibly took her there before killing her. Wanda was killed by someone, intentionally or accidentally, at her group home, and that individual took her out to where her remains were later found. If what happened differed from these possibilities, it still would have had to include an element of at least one of them. In the end, she either got there by herself or was taken there by someone else. It seems to me it would be unlikely that if she was killed near Gresham, that her killer would take her that some 45 miles away to where she was later found, but be safer and hide her somewhere secluded but closer. This leads me to think if she were killed, then she likely encountered her killer not too far from where her remains were left. The fact that we still don't know exactly when Wanda disappeared, we cannot say if she ran away from her group home, if she died immediately after, or possibly was living around somewhere else a while before she died. Where would that place have been? Could being a runaway on the streets have led her further east, hinting in the direction of Government Camp in Trillium Lake? There have also been primarily two theories that have gone around in terms of who may have been responsible for Wanda's death. I personally don't find either of them to be very strong, but that isn't to say that they're impossible. The less likely of the two, I feel, is Rodney Alcala, a serial killer who was at his worst during the late 1970s. Using his position as a photographer, Alcala manipulated countless women into posing for him. Many of his pictures were found, and many of the women in them remain unidentified. But some have noted a strong comparison between one particular woman in one of his pictures and Wanda Ann Herr. When the advanced aged picture of Wanda is compared with her, the connection becomes even stronger. I don't believe they're the same person, but it certainly is captivating. Alcala was also in prison into 1977 before being released, meaning Wanda would have had to disappear much later than it's been predicted she did if he were to be responsible. A little bit of smoke, not much fire. The other possible suspect, whom I feel is the stronger of the two, is John Aykroyd, who killed at least a few women between the late 70s and early 90s. His first known kill was in 1978, less than 50 miles in almost a straight line south from where Wanda's remains were found. While this area wouldn't have been too far to go, it would have required Aykroyd to go a bit out of his way as he worked along Highway 20 and his known victims were killed near that highway as well. I have strong doubts in this instance as well as Rodney Alcala and think it more likely that Wanda just ran into the wrong person, someone with a name we wouldn't necessarily know, and a desire to kill that Wanda didn't notice. It's all a truly bizarre mystery, and tragically, there's been little progress on the matter. Oftentimes, when an unidentified victim is finally identified, Even the most obscure of victims often have a relatively well-structured life story. But Wanda Ann Herr and how she died is shrouded in mystery of every kind. Time appears to be the only thing that may resolve some of these mysteries and help us uncover what happened to Wanda and, if she was murdered, bring her killer to justice.